Welcome to week 4 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. I just want to start off with a few announcements. Upcoming dates, just groups 1, 2, and 3. You're briefing April 12th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And what I'm going to do is break you guys into time slots. So group 1 will brief at 9 o'clock. Group 2 will brief at 9:30. Group 3 will brief at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to keep you guys separate so I can give comments to you guys individually and bring up any issues individually with the group and with the group itself. So plan for 20 to 25 minutes for briefing and 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So that's how we'll go. Be online on the Zoom, and I'll send you a link. 9 o'clock for group 1, 9:30 for group 2, 10 o'clock for group 3. For those of you who aren't in the groups, April 15th, your strategy paper on week 3 and week 4 topics are due. That'll be April 15th at 11:59 Eastern Standard Time. So keep that in mind. So paper 1, everyone's got their grades back. I just wanted to kind of hit the highlights. I think most people got it. Some people probably have some improvement there, but I think the purpose was to show that you understood what requirements were, understood what the ints were, and could apply it to a certain situation. So the big issue, again, the requirements were way too broad. And I got a lot of topics on immigration, border wall, MS-13. So I guess we're, making America great again. But for some reason, half to almost 2/3 of you chose those topics well. And again, I don't want to say everyone did this, but some people would say, hey, we used aerial reconnaissance to secure the border. And that would be a requirement, and the GeoInt analysis used behind it. Well, I'm going to tell you that, and I hear this from Congress, I hear this from everywhere, that you can't just send out GeoInt to secure the border. The border is 3,000 miles long, and the aircraft only can cover certain parts. And again, an aircraft just sitting above the border looking for 24 hours a day, trying to find people crossing the border is pretty difficult. The GeoInt, or the ISR in this case, would work in a very narrow, when you've done your homework beforehand and you know where your potential border crossings are, only then would GeoInt work in very narrow parameters. So I just want to make that clear. That's just, I use the border wall as an issue. Another issue, again, MS-13. A lot of you talked MS-13. I guess it's in the news of late. But trying to use HUMINT for MS-13 and just trying it with a broad requirement that says find out where there's an MS-13 presence is too much of a requirement. A better requirement, again, if you narrow it down, MS-13 are MS-13 gang members in Fairfax County utilizing home connections back in El Salvador to advance drugs or other criminal activity. That would be a more narrow requirement that can be used. And again, it has to be so narrow that you can actually put a collection asset against the requirement. So that's what I wanted you to try and take away from that and make it clear. So again, the whole point was just so you can start thinking about using Intel to drive processes, to drive policy, to drive operations, and to make sure that your Intel requirements are so narrow that it can actually do that. And then some of you, I think, a lot of you actually waged into policy versus Intel requirements. I particularly heard people who are doing business intelligence. Is your office being productive? Staying away from social media and working. That's not an intelligence requirement because there's no adversarial relationship. That's mainly a policy or an internal procedures issue. So in order for it to be an Intel requirement, again, it has to be faced against some sort of competition, some sort of adversary out there. And I think, it's sometimes a fine line because, Intel does drive policy, but again, internal procedures, internal requirements, even if it's internal like cyber, some people have talked about cybersecurity in their offices, and some of it was procedural. Are there people making sure that they're using double-coded or two-factor authentication? That's more of a policy. What would be the Intel requirement is Russia or corporate adversaries using spoofing and spear phishing to hack into our passwords. So I just want to make sure that's clear that there's a distinction between what the policy is and what the intel is to drive the policy. And then social media exploitation. A lot of you brought this up, and that's good. We didn't talk about it too much, and maybe we should have in this class because it's becoming a lot more of an apparent. Just keep in mind, social media exploitation works in some cases, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work to examine North Korean missile developments for obvious reasons. It doesn't work for MS-13 because MS-13 tends to be more of a, they don't use virtual radicalization. They use real radicalization or in-person connections. And MS-13 is known for not being as social media, being more familiar, or for using family connections and actual social connections and not broad-based media connections. So just keep in mind, social media wouldn't be good in those cases. It would be good to examine Russian involvement in the Ukraine, ISIS outreach in the United States. So keep that in mind, that social media, if you're going to use it as a tool, just make sure it's an appropriate tool for the condition you're looking at. So I hope that was good. I hope you put pen to paper. I think everyone did it at least decently well for paper one. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. And I'm more than happy to discuss it if there's issues either at the Zoom session or even if you want to talk about it beforehand. So week 3 review. 2 great case studies, the Pearl Harbor case study and the Yom Kippur War case study. Dahl brings this up because it's a way, I'm not going to rehash the Pearl Harbor incident. I think everyone did a pretty good job of discussing where the Intel fault lines were. But I want to talk about the schools of thought related to not just Pearl Harbor, but Intel failure to begin with. And you have the traditional school, and Dahl brings this up, of, Intel... Intel is, this is the connect the dots issue, that there's enough information out there, but we fail to connect the dots. Analysts fail to do their jobs properly. And that was in the Wallstetter, that was cited by some of you. And this absolves the commanders on the ground, and just says there's just too much information out there. The second is the reformist school, and this is the boxes. The organization intelligence wasn't there. That you had, whether you had too much information, too little information, doesn't matter, because information was collected at the federal level, information was collected at the military level, and because the organization was mismatched, you couldn't stop the intelligence failure. And you see some of this, Dahl brings this up a little bit, where he talks about, and some of you brought it up, that intel was collected at the Washington, D.C. strategic level, but because of various issues, it was never disseminated down to the commanders on the ground. And again, this is what a lot of the families of both Kimmel and Short bring up and say they knew that there was intel at the level, but because of mismanagement or misorganization, it wasn't disseminated down. And you'll see this in the 9/11 case study when we talk about connecting the dots or having a bad intelligence organization that could have facilitated stopping 9/11. Then you have the contrarian school, which says that there's not a lot, that it's not necessarily the analysis, but the collection of intelligence. And the inability to collect intel, and this blank puts intelligence squarely on the collectors, the human signals intelligence, that either there's a lack of it or it's not properly collected, and this causes problems along the lines for various reasons. So again, a lot of the Dahl brings up kind of separates this, and I think when you're looking at intel failure, whether it's Pearl Harbor, Yom Kippur War, you could probably take a little bit from each one of these schools of thought. The Dahl, his thesis is that the interface between the analysts and the policymakers wasn't, or the analysis wasn't conveyed well to the policymakers, that they didn't have enough tactical intelligence. And Dahl makes this argument, and you read about it, that there is a interface that the policymaker or the analysts have to give intel that's precise and actionable in order for the policymakers to be receptive to that intelligence. Otherwise, it's just information that's out there that can't drive decisions. And that's why Dahl brings up why Pearl Harbor happened, because they had good strategic intelligence, but the actual tactical, the time and place of the attack was lacking, and that's why the commanders weren't very receptive to it. I think Dahl has a very good book here. That's why I sign it. I think he's written very well, but I would disagree with this. Rarely is intelligence so tactical and finite that you can mitigate, or you get the enemies are going to attack at 9 o'clock at this time at this place coming from this direction. That's very, very rare. For those of you who are in Iraq and Afghanistan, never do you get the intel report that says there's going to be an IED planted at this exact location at this time by this person. That doesn't happen. What you do get is analysis, and I'll use the IED and Iraq example to further my point. You get analysis that lets you reduce risk. So you might not get the time, place, and location of your IED, but based on the intelligence, based on the pattern analysis, you can say, okay, this is the time window you're most likely to get hit. This time window and this general location. Therefore, I don't recommend you move your big convoys moving at this route, or if you are driving, take these appropriate countermeasures. Drive slowly, use your jammer, etc., to mitigate risk for those units. And that's part of what Intel, or I don't want to say part, that is a huge portion of what Intel is. When we go to we're going to talk about 9/11. Nowhere are you going to get the tactical intelligence of 9/11 that says they're going to attack on this time, this place, using this vector. But you can use certain history and certain points to mitigate risk. If you think of a scenario like 9/11 happening, and you can put these 1 or 2, 3 countermeasures to stop it, that's intelligence driving a policy or an operational issue that mitigates risk. And that is part of what we do. So if I'm not clear on that, please let me know. I just want to make sure that point gets across, because that's a huge point of this class and a huge point of this program as well. And then we're going to go with the Sharma School TM, and that's a corollary off the Dahl. And what I say by this, the Sharma School, kind of, it's a corollary off Dahl, because I talk about the policy analysis, policy interface. And one of the problems, again, is that the analysts don't give enough of a recommendation for the policymakers to mitigate risk. And I'll give you the Pearl Harbor example. If the intel had given enough that said, okay, Admiral Kimmel, General Short, if you increase the level of patrols, if you increase the level of long-range reconnaissance, if you cancel Sunday leaves, which is one of the reasons why Pearl Harbor was so unprepared, you can mitigate risk. And the intel analysts didn't go to that level to frame the issue for the policymakers. And that, I think, is an intel failure that happens. And again, 9/11, we're going to talk about 9/11. If the intel analysis was said, sir, ma'am, I think there's going to be a aircraft hijacking used to as a Tomahawk missile, but all you have to do to stop that is increase federal air marshals by 20 to 30%, or increase lock doors, or just put the drink cart. For those of you who fly now, you probably see a drink cart in front of a cockpit. If you did that, you would have prevented a 9/11. So you have intel driving doable, understandable, cost-effective countermeasures that can stop catastrophe. That is what, I'll call it the Sharma School, just because I like naming things after myself. But just think about that as you go forward, about how Intel can use simple countermeasures to reduce risk. And then Yom Kippur War, again, you could talk about these case studies from the Yom Kippur War, the traditional reformist contrarian. There was in the documentary, they talk about over-reliance on human, one single source. And you saw that in the Al Jazeera documentary, where they talk about, well, we're not going to make a move for Yom Kippur War. We're not going to make a move until our one human source that's embedded in the Egyptian military comes back to us. Now, he was semi-right. He was a couple hours off there, but you waited until he gave the go-ahead, and that's probably one of the pitfalls of Humant. Humant relies on humans, and he had relying on that one source to mitigate your war plans was a pretty big failure. All right, so addiction to preconceived notions. That was the concept that was brought up in the Avi Shlaim and brought up in other readings that you had, that the Egyptians and Syrians would not attack until they could mitigate Israeli Air Force with either an Air Force themselves or a surface-to-surface missile. And so they had that preconceived notion. They waited, and then that prevented them from reacting to the surprise from Egypt and Syria. And then the lack of an intelligence estimate. Again, the Israelis didn't do a very good net assessment looking at, one of the other surprises was the anti-tank missile to tank that they didn't really take into account, the surface-to-air missile to aircraft that they really didn't do a very good estimate on how effective the surface-to-air missiles would be on Israeli aircraft. And that was a pretty stunning blow to the Israelis themselves. So week 4 preview. I'm going to that wraps up week 3, going on to week 4. 2 case studies are Iraq and 9/11. So 2 big issues that affected the modern intelligence community. For many of you, it's history, depending how old you are. For me, I lived through those events, so they're not necessarily history for me. So week 4 I'm just going to give you a heads up. It's a lot of work. This is more work, probably the most work this week than you'll have for any other week. A lot of readings, a lot of documentaries, a lot of my lecture. So the first case studies are the case studies again are Iraq WD and 9/11. Iraq WMD, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Catastrophic failure. Those of you who don't remember, we went to war because of WMD in Iraq. And we were in Iraq for, depending on when you say it, but I would say we're still in Iraq now, so it's 16, 17 years, or 14, 15 years now that Americans have been dying in Iraq. And we went to war because we thought they had WMD, and obviously they did not. So the documentary, you have the Rachel Maddow documentary. It is a political documentary. Rachel Maddow is definitely a political commentator, so take it with a grain of salt there. But the information is accurate. that she brings up. So keep that in mind. Obviously, the narrative is political, but keep in mind the individual incidents that she brings up and how it got into the American bloodstream on the various WMD issues. So 60 Minutes Curveball. If you don't know who Curveball is, you're gonna find out. You're gonna find out who he is, and you're gonna find out how we screwed that up pretty seriously. So the committee report, the Senate Select Committee report on WMD. There's a chapter on it on Iraq WMD. It's 200 pages. Don't read the whole thing. Just focus on the blue boxes, and you'll see it in the report. Those are the actual recommendations and assessments. Focus on those blue boxes. Read if you want to get a little bit more detail on that. But I can't assign the whole thing because again, it's 200 plus pages. And then obviously the Sharma, my lectures on politicization and IC failures. Those are key to put everything into context. And what I ask is that you probably, in Canvas, the sections are kind of mixed in, and I apologize for that, but I think it would be best to just focus on Iraq WMD, watch the documentaries, read the readings, listen to my lectures, and then do your discussion point for Iraq WMD, and then come back to 9/11, which is the second case study. So again, 9/11, the documentaries, National Geographic, Road to 9/11, or Up to 9/11, Disc 1, but it's on YouTube there. And then the Nova NSA documentary. 2 excellent documentaries that'll explain 9/11. You have the Doll, again, using that going back to that book that you read for week 3. And then you have the 9/11 Commission, just the one chapter on the recommendations. And then you have the Sharma lectures that focus on 9/11 and could it have been prevented. So again, busy week coming up ahead. And as always, if there's issues or questions, please let me know.